And let's say you buy a stock and it goes up. You should not think that that means every time you buy a stock, you're smart enough to find a winner. Understand your limitations. Use some combination of enthusiasm and caution. That's my recommendation. If you want to gamble, go to a pachinko parlor.
And in terms of buying a bond, and if our interest rate is going to high, as you mentioned, due to structural changes, yes, you should suffer losses from buying a bond. What do you think about that on the risk?
This is the rule with bonds. Rates up, price down. Rates down, price up. It's what we call a fluctuation, but it's not a loss. It's only a loss if you sell it. If the company is able to keep its promises of paying the interest and the principal according to the contract, then that will be recouped. You buy a bond at 100, interest rates go up, the price goes down. You hold it, guess what? At the end, you end up with your money back and the interest. So this form of investing, the general heading for this kind of investing is fixed income. You know what that means? Fixed. The outcome is fixed, and it's fixed by the contract. So you have to distinguish between a temporary negative fluctuation and a real loss. A negative fluctuation is not a real loss. Investors of all levels, from the lowest investor individual to the richest institutions, pay too much attention to what's called volatility. It doesn't matter. What matters is how much do you have today, how much will you have at the end. And whether it goes up and down or whether it's smooth, doesn't matter. Other than if you can get to a spot in the stream which is deep enough, you can drown if you don't have the ability to survive. So every portfolio has to afford survivability. That means, in particular, I keep coming back to it, your intestines. You have to have what it takes to hold on in the tough times. Not unduly, that's the hard part. Because, sometimes something goes down a little and then it goes down more. But for the most part, in general, most things come back up. Bonds almost always come back up. That's why they're safer. You know, Warren Buffett says, I'd rather have a lumpy 15% return than a smooth 12.
Yes.
And the question is, can you live with the lumpiness of the 15?
You know, there's various type of bonds,
Yes.
corporate bond,
Yes.
government bond, short-term bond, long-term bond. Do you have any preference among them?
Well, I think the ones I'm talking about are number one, corporate. Government bonds don't pay much interest because the government is relatively safe, you know. Today the government bonds pay 4-ish. I'm talking about 8. So you have to take some uncertainty to get 8, and that means corporate. If you invest for 1 year, you don't enjoy the benefit very long. If you invest for 30 years, that's extremely long, and the fluctuations in the interim will be very big. So I would recommend what we call intermediate term bonds between 7 and 10. And by the way, while we're on the subject of how to select bonds, I don't think most people should select their own bonds. Most people should invest in a mutual fund or ETF, professionally managed, with a history of doing reasonably in the bad times. You know, the question for the investor is not how well the things do when in the good times. The question is how bad are they in the bad times. Again, I think for most investors, other than you may be a dreamer, but for most investors, maximizing return is not as important as assuring safety. And that comes from looking for funds that have done well in the bad times. In the good times, everybody makes money. Some people make a little more. You may be attracted by how good the returns were in the good times, but then you have to say to yourself, how did they make that extra money? Was this a high-risk vehicle? And if it's a high-risk vehicle, how would they do in the bad times? I'm a cautious individual, so I'm more concerned with how bad things could be in the bad times and the individual's ability to live through it, to get through the low spots in the stream. To me, that's more important than being sure that I made the absolute highest return I could.
Yes, thank you. Let's move to another topic. Back in March, I'm talking about banking crisis. I thought a massive one was coming, but it seems to have passed smoothly.
Yes.
So, do you think the banking system is stable?
The banking system in this country is very well stable. The banks are very well capitalized. I put out a memo, perhaps, lessons from Silicon Valley Bank, in which I said that the problems of the 4 banks went under. And I said in the memo that the problem was not some, what we call systemic problem of all the banks interconnected. It was the result of mistakes that were made at individual banks by managements that misjudged the situation. And I still feel that way. I don't think we have a banking crisis. That was not a crisis. That was 4 problems. Nobody lost money.
Yes, this seems like a related question. There are many predictions about recession coming next year.
There are many predictions.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that risk?
Well, my main thoughts are that I don't believe predictions. Nobody knows. The Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, has hundreds of PhD economists, and they can't even predict what the Fed is going to do. The Fed can't predict what the Fed is going to do. So how can anybody predict? Now, in late 22 or early 23, it was unanimous that we would have a recession this year. No recession. So it's very important that your viewers understand how erroneous, undependable forecasts are. But the consensus is inflation is behaving well. It's coming down. That means the Fed won't have to raise rates anymore. That means it will not produce a recession, or maybe a minor recession, or what we call soft landing, no recession. And that will permit the Fed to start cutting rates, which will stimulate the economy and be good for the market. That's what the optimist thinks now. He may be right, he may be wrong. I'm just reporting the consensus. I'm not smart enough to have an opinion on whether the consensus is correct.
In Korea, there is significant interest among the individual investors in investing in the US. If you were to provide advice to investors, especially young individual investor in Korea, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I think the U.S. has the best economy and the best business sector in the world. I can't think of a place I'd rather have my money in the world. On the other hand, I have a lot of respect for Korea, and I think the business community there is strong, efficient, hardworking, smart. So I think that it should be a balance. Now, you don't have to have money in every country in the world. Just a mix of U.S. and Korea, I think, would be a good idea. You may conclude, reasonably, that you're a young person. You want to learn, so you're going to invest with some adventure in order to explore, but not amounts of money that would be fatal. Just like, you may say, I want to go climb mountains or scuba dive, but not so much that it could be fatal. And there's nothing wrong with experimentation. When you're young and you have lots of time, I mentioned that the retiree may not have long enough to wait for the cycle to recover. The young person has decades ahead to fix their mistakes, and there's nothing wrong with experimenting to improve your capabilities and learn about the market. Now, you should do it intelligently. You shouldn't just say, oh, I like that company because the chairman wore a red tie, or I like that company because the name starts with H and my name starts with H. You should have good reasons. You should do a serious study. You should read books. What does it take to be an investor? You know, the worst thing is to say, oh, I'm going to just buy some companies that seem good to me. When I lived in Los Angeles, there was a guy who advertised on the radio. And he said, well, you know, if you go into a store and you like the product, buy the stock. That's not a good enough reason. You have to understand the company and its finances and whether it's profitable and what its growth possibilities are. You shouldn't buy something on a whim. But this is a great time for young people to do a serious study, first, of what investing consists of and how to be successful. Secondly, start doing it. Don't start doing it before you understand the basics. But it's a fascinating activity. But the other thing is, you should always understand your limitations. And let's say you buy a stock and it goes up. You should not think that that means every time you buy a stock, you're smart enough to find a winner. Understand your limitations. Use some combination of enthusiasm and caution. That's my recommendation. If you want to gamble, go to a pachinko parlor.
Thank you so much, Mr.